Alright, so this video is a follow-up to the previous episode where we talked about the rest and spread operators. Basically, in this video, I want to take a deeper dive into both of those, and I want to look at a whole bunch of different examples just to make sure that the idea sinks in, because this is something that's actually been a little bit confusing and difficult for me at first. So I want to make sure that we all understand the new syntax. So let's begin with the spread operator, and let's first look at array literals. So one of the use cases for the spread operator would be a simple function call. So let's say we had a function here, and the function was called announce metalists. And let's say we had three metalists. We had the first one, we had the second one, and the third one. And let's say we basically wanted to announce who the metalists are. We basically wanted to announce the names. Let's do console log. And we could actually use the backticks or the string literals that I explained a couple of videos ago. And we could basically do first one gold, of course the second one silver, and the last one be the third one bronze. Okay, so pretty simple. Now the way we would call that function is, well, very simple. You basically provide the list of names. Let's do Mark, Alex, John. So that's going to give us the result on the right, and that works just fine. But consider that you wanted to pass the elements as an array. So let's say we had the elements, so we had the names. Let's do winners equals an array of names. How would you extract the elements of that array without refactoring the function? So of course we could pass just a single argument and call it, let's say, winners. And then you could get your, first, second, and third. In fact, let's do that. We could use the new destructuring syntax. We could do first, second, third. And that's going to equal to winners. And as you can see, that's going to work perfectly fine. It's basically going to extract all the elements from the winners array using destructuring. But let's say we didn't want to use destructuring. And let's say we had 3 arguments to the function. Let's even go as far as saying that we couldn't actually refactor the function. We had to keep the same function signature. How would you go about that? And now in the past, what you would typically do is you would revert to an older approach using the apply function or the apply method. Now the apply method is similar to the call method that we saw in the previous video. The difference is that the call method expects an argument list. So if you wanted to call the call method, the very first argument, like I mentioned before, would be what this object would become, right? So in this case, we could just simply pass null, and then you could pass your arguments individually. So we could pass the names like this. Instead of an array, you just basically pass them one by one, okay? And as you can see on the right, that's going to work. But if you wanted to pass the elements as an array, so instead of passing them individually, you pass an array of those elements or arguments, we could still do that, but in this case, we need to use the apply method. And as you can see, it's also going to work. So the apply method basically passes an object. This is going to become the current or calling object inside of the function. And the second argument is basically an array of all the elements that are going to be passed inside of that function as function arguments. What you could do in ES6 is now, instead of using the apply function, you could simply use the spread operator and then pass your winners directly. So this is basically going to expand the array of winners, the array of names, and it's going to pass every single element directly inside of that function. And this way you're going to get all the names and all the results on the right. One of the other things that you could do is you could actually combine arrays. Let's do something silly here. Let's say we had a little bit of drama here. Let's say we're going to do 3 words. That's going to be an array of course, I love you. Okay, and let's say we had a second array. Let's do a love story. A little bit of a love story here. So let's do he said something. So I'm just going to put a comment for now. And left her forever. Very dramatic here, okay? So let's say you wanted to insert the first array inside of the second one. So instead of the comments that we have right there, let's say we wanted to put that array inside of the love story. How would you go about that? Well, in ES5 it's sort of difficult. You basically have to split the array, or you have to inject the 3 words at a given index. In ES6 it's pretty simple. You just use the spread operator, so you use the 3 dots and then you put your 3 words inside of it with a comma. So now if you do console log of your love story, you're basically going to get all the elements, and if you do join with a space, that's going to give you a complete sentence, as you can see. So that's as far as combining arrays. Now what if you wanted to create a copy of an array? Let's say we had a Trinity, we had Cortex, we had Neo-Cortex, okay, and we had Medulla. So the 3 brains. How would you create a copy of that array? It's actually very simple in ES6. Let's say we have a copy and we have a new array. We use the spread operator and we basically pass the Trinity inside of it. So now if you did console log of copy, you're going to get the exact same array as before. Now one of the things to note is that this way of copying is known as shallow. So in contrast to deep copying, the shallow copying actually preserves the same elements inside of the array. So in this case, there's really no side effects because we're dealing with strings. And strings are what's known as primitive types. Other primitive types are also integers and booleans. So if we had, let's say, numbers inside of that array, that's also fine. There's going to be no side effects whatsoever. But if you were working with arrays, or let's say if you had multi-dimensional arrays, then you could potentially introduce a problem or a bug, because if you modify the elements inside of the copied array, you would also modify the original elements inside of the original array. So this is typically the use case where you would reach out to utility libraries like _Lodash, because those have utility methods that essentially allow you for deep copying. Just keep in mind that the spread operator only provides you with shallow copy of, in this example, an array. And if you have an array of objects, if you mutate the copy, you're also going to mutate the original. If you mutate the original, of course, that's also going to affect the copy. Now, another use case that you might run into is array concatenation. So let's say we had an array of upper body muscles. So we had, let's say, biceps, we had triceps, we had, let's say, chest. What else? Let's say we had delts and maybe back, right, all of the biggest muscles. Let's say we also had lower body muscles. And let's say we had glutes, hamstrings, quads, and maybe calves. So what if you wanted to concatenate the 2 arrays? Let's say you wanted to have your muscles. In ES5, you could use the concat method. So you could basically use the first array, and then you could call the concat method off of it, and then you would pass the second one as the argument. And if you did console log of your muscles, of course, that's going to give you basically an array that contains all the elements of the first one and the second one. And if you wanted to reverse the order, you would basically use the lower, sorry, I made a typo right there. You would use the lower body muscles, and you would pass the upper body muscles as the argument to the concat method. And as you can see right there, the lower body muscles are going to go first. And of course, in ES6, that's no longer necessary. You could use the spread operator. So if you wanted the upper body muscles to go first, you put the 3 dots, use the upper body muscles. This by itself is just going to give us the upper body muscles. But if you wanted the lower body muscles, you put a comma, 3 dots, the spread operator, and then you put your lower body muscles, and that's going to give us the same result. If you wanted the lower body muscles first, again, reverse the order, upper body muscles second, and that's going to give us all the muscles of the lower body and the upper body. Now, the other use case that you actually saw in the previous video would be to convert an array-like object into an array. So you've already seen the use case with arguments. Let's say we had a simple function here, print, and we basically wanted to print all the elements that were passed into it. So the way you would use it is, let's say, print JavaScript is awesome, okay, And what you would do next is you would basically call console log with the arguments with the spread operator that basically extracts all the elements of the arguments object inside of the log method on the console object. Okay, now if you wanted to access the arguments as an array, let's say we would basically do args equals, we have an array, we have the 3 dots, and the arguments object. If you wanted to console log that, the args, of course that's going to give us an array of all the strings that we passed. They don't have to be strings, they could also be, numbers. That's going to give us an array of those numbers. They could be primitives, objects, they could even be functions. They could basically be anything that you provide. Now the other use case would be when working with DOM elements. So I'm going to open up the HTML tab on the left. Okay, I'm going to bring back the JavaScript tab. Let's say we had buttons here. Let's say we had a submit button. And we also had a, let's say, cancel button. Oops, made a typo there. Button. Right, so how does that look like? Let's see, we have 2 buttons. Okay. What if you wanted to access those buttons as DOM elements? Typically, you would do something like this. So let's say let buttons equals, and then we could do document get elements by tag name. Okay, we want to target the buttons. Let's do console log buttons. See what that gives us. And the log is too large. Let's open the DevTools. Well, that gives us an HTML collection. Interesting. This is a perfect place for a bug. So if you thought that the buttons object would be an array, and if you tried to do something like buttons for each, and let's say we even tried to provide a callback with the button, and you wanted to do console log of that button, you're going to see that it gives us a type error because buttons for each is not a function, meaning that there's no for each method on the buttons object, whatever the buttons object is. In this case, it's an HTML collection. This is similar to the example where we had the arguments object, and we couldn't also call any array methods off of that object. And that's understandable because neither the arguments object nor the HTML collection are arrays. They're actually objects, and that's why you can't call array methods onto them. But what we could do is we could use a new spread operator, right? We could put the 3 dots, close the bracket. That's going to give us an array of all the buttons, or basically all the elements that the result of this call would contain. So when you call documents get elements by tag name and you pass the button, that's going to give us an HTML collection. But if you extract all the elements of that collection into an array, you're going to get an array with all the buttons. And now you could apply the for each method onto that array, and you could basically loop through them. So that's pretty useful. Now let's remove all of that because we no longer need it. Let's close the DevTools. I'm going to bring back whatever we had before. Let's clear out the logs. Now let's move on to objects. One of the use cases when working with objects would be to clone objects. So let's say we had a rectangle here, and it's basically going to be a set of different styles. So let's say width 200 pixels. Let's say we had height 100 pixels. Let's say we also had background, that was green. Let's say we had opacity of 0.5. And let's say we wanted to create a copy of that object. In the past, especially with ES6, you could do something like this. So you could do var copy equals, and you could use Object.assign method. Typically, the first element would be an empty object. This would be the target object, and then the second one would be the source object. So we could pass the rectangle. If you did console log of copy, that's going to give us a copy of that object with all the properties and all the property values. Now what the assign method allows us to do is to basically copy enumerable and own properties from either one or more source objects that you provide. So the first argument that you provide is basically the target object. We could already have some of the properties. So let's say we had font size 12 pixels. The resulting object is already going to have the font size, but it's also going to have all the properties of the rectangle. Now, rectangle is not the only source object that we could provide. We could also pass another object. Let's do color black. Okay, and that's another object, and the color property of this object is also going to be inserted into the resulting object, as you can see right there, color black. So the three properties of all of those objects are going to be stored inside of the copy, and the very first one basically used as the target, and the subsequent objects are going to be used as sources. Now if you were using the spread operator, it becomes really simple. We would have our copy, and we would basically have an empty object with three dots, the spread operator, and then you basically put your rectangle like so. Now it doesn't seem like CodePen likes the syntax. Let's enable Babel here. Yep, and we get the exact same copy. And of course you could put more properties. Let's say we had color yellow. Okay, you could put properties before or after. Let's say font size 12 pixels. And actually the order of properties, the way you put them, does matter. We're going to see this in a follow-up example in a few minutes. But for now, just remember that neither the Object.assign method nor the spread operator allow you to perform deep cloning. So the cloning that you see here when we create a copy, that's basically doing a shallow copy. If you had properties and those properties contained objects, so let's say we had a typography property here, and this was an object, let's see, with color black, font style perhaps italic, then when you copy the rectangle object, you would also copy a reference to that same typography object. So if you modified the typography object on the rectangle, it would also affect the same object in the copy. In fact, let's do that. Let's prove that. So let's do rectangle dot typography dot color equals red, and let's do console log rectangle, and let's do console log copy. Let's see what happens. You're going to see that we get two objects. The first one is a rectangle, the second one is the copy, and that copy is also going to contain the font size and the color. But you can already see that when we modified the color on the typography property of the rectangle, we assigned red to it, we also indirectly modified the color of the typography property of the second object of the copy. So this just basically means that the spread operator only goes one level deep, and it doesn't allow for deep copying or deep cloning. And this goes the same for Object.assign method as well. And like I said before, this is a typical use case where you would use a library like Lodash, underscore, or Ramda. So just to reiterate, to create a simple copy, you basically use the two curly braces to create a new object, and then you pass your rectangle, and this is basically going to create a shallow copy of the rectangle. Now let's talk about merging objects. Let's say we had an object of background, and this was basically a set of styles for the background. Let's say position was center, let's say size was cover, so that it's full sized. Let's say we also had image, and this was basically a URL, and maybe something like background.png. Okay. Let's say we also had typography, styles, and we had something like color red. We had font size of 10 pixels, and maybe also line height of 1.5. Okay. So if you wanted to merge the two objects, in the past you could use the Object.assign method. Let's say we had styles, and we'd do Object.assign. First of all, you have your target object, that's going to be an empty object, but then you also have background, and then you have typography. If we did console log of styles, it's going to give us an object that's going to contain both the typography properties as well as the background properties. But of course in ES6 you no longer have to do this. You could use the spread operator, so similar to how you would do this with arrays, you would put the three dots with the spread operator, you would have your background, and then you would have your typography, like so. And this is going to give us the exact same object as before. Okay? Now another use case would be creating a new object from an old one. So let's say we had a human object, and of course every single human eats food. He drinks water, and he also breathes air, okay? And maybe also sleeps typically 8 hours, but it kind of depends. Now let's say we also had a superhuman, and the superhuman is going to run fast, and he also jumps high. So if you wanted to extract all the properties of the human inside of the superhuman, how would you go about that? In ES5 you could use the Object.assign method, okay? And the first thing you do is you pass all the properties that the superhuman exhibits, and then second you pass the human object. And then if you did console log superhuman, you're basically going to get all of those properties together. Now keep in mind the syntax of the Object.assign method, because the first thing you do is you pass a target, right, the target object, and the second thing you do is you pass your sources. So in this case we only have one, we have the human object. The important thing to note is that the properties in the source or the sources are going to override the properties in the target. So for example, if the superhuman actually sleeps, let's say, only 2 hours, and you pass the human as the source, you're going to see that the resulting object is going to be a human that sleeps 8 hours, even though it's a superhuman that also runs fast and jumps high. So one way to alleviate that would be to first pass an empty object and pass the human, and then lastly pass all of the properties of the superhuman that's basically going to overwrite anything that goes before it. But let's say if you wanted to use the ES6 syntax, let's do superhuman. It's going to be a new object. Let's extract everything that the human does. And let's also say runs fast and also jumps high, and of course sleeps 2 hours. The properties that we pass after the human object are basically going to override anything that the human object provides. And of course, just like before, if you pass those properties first, you can expect that you're going to get the 8 hours of sleep afterwards. And in fact, once we do console log of superhuman, we're going to get 8 hours, and that's because whatever the properties that human has, if they collide, they're going to override whatever the superhuman has. But if you provide those properties first, like so, let's remove this space, you're going to see that we get 2 hours of sleep, and of course we get the jumps high and runs fast properties. Now the last thing to note is that the spread operator can also be combined with the structuring of objects. So let's say we had a post. The title was 10 things I love about JavaScript. The disclaimer was all of this info is subjective, okay. And then let's say we had an author, Alex. We also had created at timestamp, and let's say this was created just now. So this is basically going to be an integer or a timestamp that represents the time of basically now. So let's say that we wanted to extract properties of that post object. So we wanted to get hold of the title, disclaimer, but we also wanted to get the two other remaining properties as a separate object. So we use the spread operator for that. Let's put them into meta variable, and let's assign it to post. So once we do console log of title, disclaimer, and as well as the meta object. So we're going to get everything that you expect. We're going to get the title, we're going to get the disclaimer, and we're also going to get an object that basically contains the author and created at. If you added more fields, let's say we added stars, and it was rated at 5. We're also going to get these stars as part of the meta object, because we basically extract all the remaining properties inside of that meta object. So this is just one of the examples of how you can combine destructuring as well as the spread operator. Now basically when it comes to the rest operator, it basically deals with a single use case, and that's the use case when we have a variable number of function arguments. So one of the examples that I already gave in this video would be to print out all the strings that you provide. So let's say we had a function, we're going to call it echo. When you call that function, you would expect to basically print out all the strings that you give to it. So let's say we have JavaScript is a cool language, okay? And the way you could print them out is, one way to do it would be to use the spread operator. And you could extract the arguments object as individual elements. We're going to get all the strings in the right. But the other thing you could do is you could also use the REST operator in order to extract all of the arguments that you provide to the function into a single array. So in this case, we could have args, and if we did console log of args, of course, in this case, we would still have to use the spread operator in order to extract those arguments. But what this would allow us to do is to basically use arrow functions. So if you wanted to use a function expression, as I talked about before, if we wanted to have an echo variable and we wanted to assign a function to it, we could use an arrow function. Let's pass in the args. In this case, we could use the REST operator in order to get an array of elements that we pass. Then you remove the curly braces, and then you have your console log like so. And this is still going to work just fine. So as I mentioned before, if you want to take the ES5 approach, no problem with that. Just keep in mind that in that case, you would be relying on the native arguments object, which is not really an array, and you can actually apply any array methods onto it. And the other thing is it also has internal properties that are specific to itself, like the callee property. So again, it's not really an array, it's actually an object. And of course, the biggest disadvantage is that it's actually not available inside of arrow functions. If you try to do console log of the arguments object inside of an arrow function, like so, like we'll have one here, let's do console log arguments. You would expect that it's going to be available, but actually it's not. We get a reference error. So of course the arguments object that's just simply one of the things to keep in mind, that the arguments object is not available inside of arrow functions. If we go back to the REST syntax, here we have an arguments array. That's basically an array of all the elements that we pass inside of the function. So the benefit here is that you could use this approach with the REST operator with both traditional and arrow functions. You get an array object that basically contains all of the arguments that you pass inside of the function, and this also reduces the boilerplate code in case you want to work with the arguments as an array. So if you had a traditional function, then you would do something like array, prototype, slice. You would have to use the call method, and only then you pass your arguments object. This is something I showed you in a previous video. This is quite a bit of boilerplate code. If you just use the spread syntax, it's much leaner, much nicer, and cleaner. Alright, so this is pretty much it for the REST and spread syntax. Thanks a lot for checking out my channel and this video, and I'm going to meet you in the next one.